Morning, Dr. Pasa. Good evening, Professor Jiang Yang. 尊敬的各位老师、各位校友、各位海内外的朋友们，大家晚上好。我是北大国发院的张宇伟。今晚上呢，我是配合杨壮老师来做跨文化领导力论坛在线分享的第27期。我们跨文化领导力论坛呢是2017年由北大国发院的教授宾巴商学院的联系院长杨壮老师在北京大学创立。之前我们做了多场论坛和年会，今年由于疫情呢，我们从线下搬到了线上，已经做了26期。话题是从跨文化领导力来展开，然后我们已经讨论和涉及到的国家呢，已经有俄罗斯、丹麦、日本、韩国、新加坡、瑞典、英国、瑞士、德国、加拿大等等。今天我们的话题呢是聚焦在美国与中国。今天杨庄老师邀请过来的嘉宾是一个重量级的嘉宾，他是美国著名的管理学者，是世界多家企业和政府机构的政策和战略顾问。他成长于印度，取得美国 MIT 工程学硕士和 MBA 学位后留在美国，成功的应聘到麦肯锡公司，然后一口气做到了高级合伙人。之后他创立了自己的战略和政策咨询公司。他现在呢，同时还是美国著名的大学 Tufts 大学的教授，主讲全球化与跨国公司战略领域的课程。今天他演讲的主题是处于拐点的中美关系、贸易、科技与信任的全方位挑战，是脱钩还是再挂钩？为了让今天晚上的演讲呢，我们听众呢收获更大呢，我们今天晚上的讲座呢采用中英文交叉的方法。帕萨教授的重要的合伙人李莹女士呢，她会把那个帕萨教授这个英文部分的重要的部分，然后提纲挈领的用中文呢翻译出来。李莹女士是帕萨教授的一个重要合伙人，她也是非常国际化的人士。她的初中、高中是在瑞典完成的，她的本科、硕士是在美国波士顿大学完成。之后呢，在美国多年，做了10多年的管理咨询工作，为多家的跨国公司做咨询工作。然后下面呢，我们就请出我们今天晚上中方的重量级教授杨壮老师来更深入的介绍一下演讲嘉宾和我们今晚讲座的初衷，并由杨老师主持今晚的论坛活动。大家云端掌声欢迎杨老师，有请杨老师。
Thank you, Yu Wei. Thank you, Arthur, and thank you, Ms. Li Ying, to come here pretty early in the morning in Boston, and pretty late, not that late, in Beijing. So we have exactly 12 hours difference. And I'm particularly want to give my sincere thanks to Partha, who has been over the years providing us with a lot of international political perspectives on complex international relations, particularly relations between China and the United States, relations between China and the rest of the other countries, as well as relations between the United States and other countries. And I just want to say a few words before we get started. Look at the picture at the back. And this is like a picture about more than 10 years ago. We were in India. This is Tata Consulting, I remembered. And we were, at the time, we remember very vividly that Tata professionals really used the benchmark of IBM to develop their strategies. It's really a very impressive international company. And we were there for about approximately 2 weeks' time and spending a very good time there and learned a lot from Indian business situation. And tonight, we invited Partha to come to this session for several different reasons. Number one, the situation has become very, very complex today in the world. And Partha is a very suitable professional, qualified professional, who is very good at providing with you his perspective of the complexities and controversial issues in the world today. And he will be able to utilize his knowledge over the years in consulting and in teaching policies, as well as teaching strategies, and in traveling to many countries. And at this particular moment, I just want to say, Partha has been studying, learning, and providing consulting services in China as well, together with his partner, Ms. Li, tonight. And also, Partha has been able to give quite a few lectures in Beijing at Peking University a few years ago. And I just want to mention one thing. And past year, just before the pandemic, and before the US and China relations were becoming not so good at the time. So we were lucky to visit Boston, and we visited also early morning, Boston Tufts University. I remember it's a Sunday, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a Sunday, and for some reason our time couldn't be arranged on weekdays, and Sunday, and Professor Partha was able to provide us with a classroom and with some snacks and some food, and spending the whole morning talking about complicated international relations. But the situation at that time was a little simpler than today, because number one, there has been no pandemic at the time, okay? And secondly, no COVID-19. And secondly, relationship between China and the United States was not as bad as it is today. And also relationship between countries at the time was still very open, and we were able to visit Boston and many other places very, very easily, freely at the time. But nowadays, much, much more difficult because of the COVID-19. And having said all this, I just want to say that Partha will be giving us a very interesting, thoughtful, and also complex analysis of the situation today. And I'm sure everybody here will be very, very interested in listening to the lecture, but I really advise everyone to think and sometimes keep notes and on what he said, and prepare your questions, because at 9 o'clock, 10 minutes past 9, and Partha will be able to have a session with us to have a Q&A session. But for the sake of complete understanding of what he is going to deliver his message, and Ms. Li Ying, at particular junction of the time and when she sees fit, will be able to provide some Chinese summary, very brief, concise summary, so that we all understand what Partha is going to talk about. It's a very comprehensive presentation today, and I have I'm looking forward to this presentation, and I want everybody have full attention to his lecture. Thank you very much. Now the table is yours.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much indeed. My reverence to you, to the leadership of Peking University, and to the people of China, people of the United States, and people all over the world. It is a fact, it is absolutely right that we are meeting at a time when the world is not as it should be. Clearly, there's a lot of tensions of all kinds with COVID-19 in between. So obviously, it is a very, very special moment when we are meeting in development of this civilization. So I have prepared my thoughts with that in mind. We have to feel all responsible that we as individuals, collectively, individually, have to look at the world differently, and in the process, continue with the progress of our civilizations. So before I begin, let me share my greetings from Boston on behalf of Ying and myself and my colleagues in Quantum Logic. It is a very special day. I don't know whether you realize today we changed our time We are 1 hour behind, so that's good news. Second, 2 days ago, we had the first snow in Boston. And 2 days from now, we will elect the new leadership in the Oval Office. So we are meeting at a very interesting time, and I hope we can make the most out of it. Now, given the importance of the subject, it is my hope that as we go through the discussion this morning in Boston, evening in Asia, I know could see many of my friends from India has also joined this meeting. It is important that we take it with the highest level of seriousness. It's not just a talk. It is our responsibility. It is our moral responsibility to see how we connect, particularly the two most important economic powers of the world, United States and China. Now, with that, I would share my screen. I have put together a presentation. And, when I think of China, this picture captures, I feel, the spirit of China, hardworking people maintaining its tradition, yet you see the touch of Western culture. This is a picture of Hong Kong taken about 70 years ago. And in the last 70 years, as you know, China has made a dramatic progress that we should all be proud of as global citizens, and particularly to the people of China, it has been a major move forward, which the world should look up to. And in the process, hopefully learn from China, become partners of China, work with China to advance the spirit of humanity. So in that, as the goal, if you will, as that's the purpose of the meeting this evening in China. The title that I've chosen is US-China Economic Relationship at the Point of Inflection, John, which you summarized very well. It is in a point where we need to think differently, but that's why I use the word inflection, and how to deal particularly with the uneasy challenges of trade, technology, and trust. And most important word here is trust. And the choice is, do we decouple? Because there's a lot of work going on in the name of deglobalization, or do we recouple? And obviously, I would like to take a position that we recouple. And to do so, we have to think very strategically. We have to think from both macro and microeconomic point of view, and in the process, make a difference. So it's my hope that as we unfold the discussion and move into the Q&A session, we would be able to address very specific issues that the companies in China is facing, the policymakers in Beijing is facing. And in the process, hopefully we'll bring in a new dialogue under the leadership of the most prestigious university, one of the most prestigious universities of the world, the Peking University. And I understand the current president of the country is from that university. So obviously you have a tremendous responsibility to serve the interest of the country. So with that spirit, I've organized my thoughts. And the way I'm looking at it, it is actually a leadership challenge to how to deal with US-driven geoeconomic and geopolitical uncertainty, US-China driven, because when two countries together, which accounts for 50% of the world, and then if you add Europe and Japan, it adds up to 80%. So 20%, including a big country like India, falls in the other 20%. But US and China constitutes today the 50% of the global economy. Any kind of uncertainty in their relationships is an uncertainty for the world, and the spillover effect could be significant. So what I would like to propose, that instead of looking at these challenges with a negative perspective, we look at it with a positive perspective. What are the lessons that we could draw out of the negativism that is in the air to move towards positivism, both in the microeconomic space as well as in the macroeconomic space? So that's how have structured the discussion today. Ying, would you like to give a quick summary?
Sure. 首先跟大家抱歉一下啊，我不是一个专业的翻译，所以有些地方可能翻的不是特别信达雅，还希望就是在座的听众能够多多包涵。那这个第一章的 slide， 格什博士他想说的主题就是说，这个中美关系的这个挑战其实是对领导力的一种挑战。中美两个国家的 GDP 加起来等于是全世界的50%，所以中美的关系不单单是对中国、对美国是有很大的影响，对全世界来说，中美关系是好是坏，都是有着非常至关重要的作用。那戈什博士他的论点是，就是说，虽然现在形势看起来非常严峻，但是中美双方都需要带着全局观的视角。不管是在宏观方面还是在微观方面，都希望能够摆脱负能量，以比较正面和积极的心态去理解并且处理这个问题。他之前一直有跟我们提到，就是说中美现在面对的问题，它并不是就是仅限于我们这个时代的问题，比如说大家说的贸易战争，像贸易这种讨论一直以来都有，比如说美国跟日本在90年代初也有这样的争论，那时候不叫贸易战争，那时候叫做贸易摩擦。那时候我印象非常深的是，就是索尼的 CEO 被问到说，你对美日的这个贸易摩擦怎么看？他非常幽默的说，摩擦它不一定都是坏事，摩擦 friction 从就是物理的角度来讲，你有了这个 friction 才有了这个能量。所以博士的观点也是希望中国就是可以带着这种比较正面的心态去面对和解决现在中美之间的摩擦，为中国的未来的发展带来新的机遇，寻找新的空间。Dr. Ghosh, back to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much. And John, you'll be happy to know, given these challenges we are facing in meeting leadership requirements in IIT Kharagpur, we are setting up a leadership academy, which you and I have spoken. And once this academy is established, obviously partnership with Peking University, Waseda University, Tsinghua, and MIT and Harvard would be something that we will be doing, because it is true that we would need a new type of leadership capacity around the world. And the point that when I look at China today, and I particularly have a tremendous amount of reverence, respect, what China has done since 1950 in formation after the new party was formed, that its effort in the last 70 years was from being a very poor country in 1950 to becoming relevant. That was the focus, and China has become relevant. That's why we are having this discussion. But as we move forward, the challenge would be to shift the needle to become a revered partner of the world. And that's the challenge. It has become relevant, but the behavior, the connectivity of China with the world has to be such that the needle moves from the right to the left. And that's a big shift. That's a big shift. And the purpose of today's presentation is, how do we make this needle move? What are the strategic levers that we will use to enable that shift? And it cannot be done alone. It has to be, leadership has to come from China, but leadership also have to come from the United States and from the other parts of the world. And that's one of the commitments we as a firm, when we launched the Quantum Logic, is focused in China to enable that shift. It's a big shift and not an easy shift. And that is the fundamental focus of today's presentation. So given that, I've organized my thoughts in 5 points today. The first point I would like to cover is to understand the nature of challenges that the world is facing, not necessarily China. And in that context, try to understand how is China being viewed, and how in the process, my humble request would be to avoid short-termism, because we, in name of being practical, we always want to do things which could be done easily. That's not the time. We have to take on the hard problems and we have to go through the hardship to solve longer term issues, not apply the rules of the game or tit for the tat. We have to take a holistic approach. So that would be the first point. Then I will specifically move into US-China relationship and uncover the myths and move towards the realities. And in the process, talk about the 3 T's: trade, technology, and trust, particularly trust. Third, how to move beyond the obvious jolts. In any kind of discussion, there's always will be some jolts, but how to develop a new paradigm of engagement so that we move away from inward-looking decoupling. You know, even in the Oval Office, the statement has been America first. That is something many of us in this country do not entertain. What we want to entertain is how could America be a revered partner of the world, as much as I would like to see China be seen as a revered partner of the world. The fourth point we'll get into is that, look, irrespective of government policies, because government policies tend to have got a lot of different agendas, Chinese companies, which are emerging, we're talking about Haier, Huawei, Lenovo, Alibaba, ByteDance, and there are hundreds of companies which has emerged beautifully and have gained a lot of respect around the world, how they should shift gears, irrespective of the thinking in the Oval Office or irrespective in the Forbidden City. I think Chinese companies have to find a ways to emerge as global companies and not be affected by the policies of any country. They should be global. And as we have talked about IBM earlier, John, when we were talking about TCS, you know, IBM is considered a global company. It's not an American company. It's not a Japanese company. It's a global company. And that is a more fundamental shift that Chinese companies have to make given where they are today. And finally, which is the most important point, and that's why the Leadership Academy and IIT, how to transition through these multiple points of inflection. And as a result, my humble suggestion would be we need a new kind of leadership, a forward-looking leadership, which could engage with the complexities of the world. Some complexities are visible, some complexities are invisible but powerful. Being able to connect both the visible and invisible dots in an innovative fashion would be the challenge of the 21st century. It's a very different kind of leadership than what defined leadership maybe in much of the 20th century. I move forward because at the ending we'll summarize this. So first we'll talk about the uneasy challenges ahead and why we should avoid short-termism and long-termism. So the first point you have to keep in mind, this is the first time in the last 100 years of global history, Eastern power has become the #1 economy in the world. By the way, this is on a purchasing power parity basis, adjusted for different price ranges in different parts of the world. So this is a very important point, that somewhere between 2010 and 15, just before Trump came into the office, there was a change of guards, if you will. The orange line is China, and this is United States. And this is, by the way, China in terms of nominal power. This is in terms of purchasing power. So in nominal power, US is still the #1. But in terms of purchasing power of the country, there was a changeover right here. And this is the first time in the last 100 years. So far in the last 100 years, it was Britain, the British Empire, followed by the US. But this is the first time you're seeing a country from outside of the West becoming #1 in the world. And that's a big shift psychologically in the minds of people in the West. That's attention #1. Attention #2 is also very important. That Japan has viewed itself as the representation of Asia for the last 100 years. After the Russian war in 1905, Japan has continued to develop, and again, very, very impressive development. but it has been the representation of Asia to the world. Member of the G7, is the only country in the G7 which is from Asia. And in 2010, China went ahead of Japan. So that's a big shift also, psychological shift. And then the other part, which is the success of Japan, has become very visible. You know, when you go to any department stores, any store in the country, you see made in China. It's a tremendous achievement for a country that from about $300 million, $300 billion today, it's about $5.7 billion of, trillion dollars of exports. And foreign direct investment has also increased rapidly. So China has become visible, both in the department stores or when you look at the investments that are happening in Sri Lanka or Africa or United States or Europe. China is visible, and that is drawing attention very rapidly, and it's all happened in the last 20 years. It was not a gradual rise. And in the process, what has happened is, which is the most dramatic change, is the gap between the China's, if you will, the exports to United States and US exports to China. And this gap is very serious, and that has been the cause of many of the discussions, and which has again happened, as you could see, in the last 10 or 15 years. And then China, in its focus to develop the western part of China, which many people do not understand. China's main effort has been to develop the western part of China, which is still not as advanced as the eastern part of China. But in the process, China has thought about a very dramatic project, which is called the One Belt, One Road. But in the many quarters, many offices of the world, particularly in the West, it is a bit misunderstood that China is taking over the world. I see China is creating the new Silk Road, the new way to trade, and in the process, it will facilitate the development of the Western China, it will facilitate the development of Central Asia, all the way to Europe, and in the process also create connections with Africa. So, but this is not understood the way China sees it, and obviously is a question of communication with the rest of the world. And indeed, when you look at a country like Africa, a continent like Africa, and if you look at foreign direct investments, China already has done about a number of projects, about 11% of the projects are from China. But in terms of capital investment, dollars invested, China stands out in Africa. So all of a sudden, what is happening in the world, China is become visible, rightly so, because China has earned the, I would say, the economic ability to do so, and it is becoming visible more and more. But what is more important, which is often perhaps not fully appreciated by the leadership in China or Chinese companies, how the geopolitics of the world has changed. Because as you know, till about the early 90s, this is how the world looked like. It was the Cold War between USSR and US defined the world. There was something called USSR, which doesn't exist today. And basically the triad power was US, European Community, and Japan. And once upon a time, when I started my career in McKinsey's, any work that we did and looked at the market, 70 to 75, sometimes 80% of the market of any product was located in these 7 countries: Japan, 4 European countries, US and Canada, the G7. And the NATO was formed, and USSR, and China was kind of viewed as an emerging power. And then we have the rest of the world, and the OPEC, the oil producing countries. But this was the nature of the balance of power, geopolitical powers in the 90s. But when you look at today, there's no order. There was an order. There's an amazing amount of disorder. So people talk about the new normal, new order. I said, why do you guys talk about new normal? It is abnormal situations we are living through, and we are living through a tremendous amount of disorder. China has emerged as a major power and replacing Japan, as we saw earlier. There's a tremendous amount of tensions in the European community because of, largely because of unemployment, because of poor management of local countries' budgets. Germany is continuously bailing out the rest of Europe, plus the tension with Brexit. OPEC is very uncertain. Russia is emerging as a different kind of a power, which is not very clear whether Russia is with China or Russia is with the United States, or it has got a different agenda. But the key is that China is in the game and everything around China is changing dramatically. A lot of question marks: his relationship with the United States, his relationship with Japan, his relationship with India. So one way of looking at it is that China has a relationship challenge with the two biggest democracies of the world, United States and India. China has a challenge with the two different kind of situations: the biggest economic power, which is the United States, and the biggest neighboring country, which is India. So that itself puts China into a bit of a difficult situation in spite of the economic success. So if you look at this world, indeed, there are a lot of hotspots around China, from Korean Peninsula, from South China Sea, tensions in Hong Kong, border tensions in India, Western China issues. And then we have a problem with what we are calling the split of political instincts in the United States, because as a result, China discussion takes place politically between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party in different ways. And either approaches may be different, but there's a lot of discussion about China. So there are a lot of different hotspots, which is shaping the image of China, maybe unfairly, but we have to always remember perception is reality, and perceptions formed unfairly is something that we have to deal with. And I am talking purely as a problem solver, neither on behalf of the United States nor on behalf of China, but as a global citizen, how we should go about solving this problem. Now, Ying, maybe you want to give a quick summary of this point.
好。Sure， 好，我做一个很快的小结啊，这第一部分博士讲的中心观点是，就是说中国在短短几十年内，通过社会各方面的奋斗和努力，就是实现了一个从比较贫穷的国家，到一个就是比较中产的与在世界上举足轻重的一个这样的位置，这是一个非常值得骄傲的成就。但同时呢，这些成就也给世界带来了更多的不确定性，然后世界本身的地缘政治也在迅速的变化中。随着中国的崛起，原有的一些就是说一战以后、二战以后，过去100年以来的一些政治经济大国之间的平衡和固有的一些观点模式都在不断的被打破。也因此产生了很多矛盾、误解，甚至最近看到了很多敌对的情绪。博士的中心观点是，就是说中国需要理解这些矛盾和误解的根本原因和它们产生的背景，以平和的心态，更好的让世界知道中国的成就和为之付出的努力。So, Dr. Ghosh, back to you.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm sorry that. And on top of that, which is at point number 7, attention 7, that COVID-19. Now, what we do not realize that the world has gotten significantly connected. What we are looking at on the x-axis is the global trade as a percentage of GDP, global GDP. It is 5 times higher than what it used to be in 1901. And on the y-axis, so the vertical axis, we are looking at population density, and obviously the world has become more populated, it's 5 times higher. Now, unfortunately, when the COVID-19 happened, it did happen in the Wuhan province, but it spread very rapidly. But the point here is that we are living in a connected world. Any infection anywhere in the world could spread. It is neither the responsibility of China nor a responsibility of any country, but it is the responsibility of the world as to how to connect with each other differently when the world is significantly more dense, population density is high, and we are more connected. And that's what we've gotten out of in the last progress we have made in the last, particularly post-World War, that we have gotten more connected, more trade, more exchange of ideas, more exchange of knowledge, more exchange of students. But with that comes a tremendous responsibility of solving certain problems, not alone, but as partners. And clearly COVID-19 has further accelerated some of the tensions that we see that we have to uncover. But in the process, what has happened is something very interesting, which I worry the most. If you stand back and let's forget China, let's forget the United States, let's think of the world. The world between 1950 to 2018 made quite a lot of progress, particularly if you look at the rise of Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Germany, the whole Europe. If you look at after the war, when Germany got destroyed, Italy got destroyed, it basically developed on the basis of globalization and basis of liberalization, including China. China has become a more of a free market economy, and have taken advantage of the globalization. So this is how I've moved. The size of the bubble shows the global exports as a percentage of GDP. So 2018, the bubble is 5 times that of 1950. But because of COVID-19, if you look at the political instincts of various countries, whether it's Hungary, whether it's England, whether it's United States, China, we have closed borders, understandably. But the political instinct is that we have to solve our problems in our own ways as opposed to learning from each other. At least that's one thing I'm noticing in the United States. And that is a dangerous U-turn. It's a very big U-turn that we have taken backwards, which will pull us back almost by 50 years. And if you really get there, that's what I'm calling the Armageddon of the fire, where governments are becoming more inward looking. Companies' supply chain is getting disrupted. And the biggest challenge is the common people, instead of looking at the future with hope, they're looking at future with hopelessness, despair. And this is particularly visible in countries like India, which is still quite poor, population density is higher. Many countries in Africa, many countries in South America, they are faced with this challenge, including, I would say, a country like the United States, where I would call the COVID divide. I use the word COVID divide. The digital divide is very strong. So this is where the globe is. You know, the globe is indeed as John, you have rightly summarized, in the middle of major turmoils, U-turns, unclarity, fuzziness. And that's where we have to see how the biggest two economic powers can come together. So with that, I would move to see the positive side of what's happened. So that's the challenge. But the thing that we should celebrate today, the whole world should celebrate, not China, is what China has achieved. You know, often people do not understand from being, when I was a young kid in 1950s, I used to hear in the radios that China and India are the 2 poorest countries of the world, that per capita income was about 100. Actually, India's per capita income was slightly higher, about $10 higher than China in 1950s. But today, as you know, this is what China has achieved. Firstly, look at the agricultural productivity. That is the Mao Zedong period, where the focus was the big leap forward, the focus was rural sector, and indeed the agricultural productivity has gone up. And that was the right thing to do, because 90% of the people of the country is to live in the agriculture, is 85% of the employment was in the agricultural sector, and that's why we want to increase the productivity, and China did. Then in the next, from mid-70s till 2000, the focus was manufacturing. And again, you see a tremendous increase in manufacturing productivity, almost by a factor of 2 again, more than 2, a factor of 3. And in the last 10, 15 years, China's focus has been on innovation, and the productivity of innovation, which measured in terms of patents per R&D person has gone up. And this is something I feel the world, particularly countries like India, countries like Brazil, should celebrate, try to understand what should be the development model. Not look at China as a communist country or this country, but China has achieved the human ingenuity, making people more productive. And that is the role of any government, to make people productive. And China has achieved that. That's one thing that we should understand. In the process, China is very important for the world. Today, 1 billion people in China fall in the middle class category. Only in 2000, it used to be 80 million. And that's a very big achievement of the Chinese economy, where not only United States, the whole world has to appreciate that China is a big market. China's consumers have the ability to consume, and if you have the right products, this is how many countries could frame their development, but only if we have the product. And China is very good in producing products, so that challenges companies in other parts of the world to see how to serve Chinese middle class market. Now that leads to a bit of a historic picture I'm sharing with you. So in the process, what we should appreciate, China is on the way to regain the stature, the economic stature it enjoyed 500 years ago. This is the share of GDP for various parts of the world. As you could see in 1500, China's share of GDP of the world used to be 25%. By the way, the South Asia, which we call South Asia today, which is the old India, which includes Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, is about 24%. Now look at the picture in 1980. Look at the picture. There's China. From 1980 onwards, is only a period of what, 20 plus, we're talking about here 40 years, is 20%. And by 2050 is expected China would be the major part of the world. And that's nothing to fear. That's expected. That's what China used to be. And given the size of the population, that is what it deserves to be, because it's after all 1.4 billion people. And if everyone is equally economically active, China's share of the world GDP would be higher and will continue to be higher. And that is something we have to understand. But what the world misses out, this is a very important exhibit, where we are looking at GDP per capita in US dollars in 2019, and we are looking at the growth in the last 10 years. Now, China is a big country. The size of the bubble is the size of the economy. US is a big country. But what people do not understand, China is still economically poorer. China's per capita income is $16,842 as opposed to the United States, almost $60,000. The prosperity gap is 3 to 1. So China has a long way to go, but already people feel that China has to slow down. But China, if government and the people should be committed to move in this territory. But obviously when China moves to this territory, the size of the bubble would be huge, given the size of the population. And that is something to keep in mind. And also another point to keep in mind is that China's GDP is still below the average GDP of the world. Average GDP of the world is about $17,000 per capita, and China is $16,840. So there is almost $300 gap that China has to close. So obviously countries like India, Bangladesh are way behind, but the point is China has an important role to play, how to pull this country towards the right, how to engage with this world, towards its right, and these countries towards its left. So obviously China has a very interesting role to play when I think of China's position in the world. So that leads to the second point. I think we have to speed up a little bit.
Should I make a quick summary, just a 1-minute summary of what you said? Oh, Dr. Ghosh?
Can you? Okay. Can you summarize?
Yeah, 就很快的跟大家小结一下，在刚才小结过后，各史博士大概说了3个点。第一个是他现在最害怕的就是因为新冠病毒的影响，全世界都有可能在开倒车，就是说在过去50年，全世界取得的在全球化方面和市场自由化方面的成就，都会因为新冠病毒之后的一些政府的举措，实行大退步。那第二点，他再次重申了，就是说全世界需要庆祝欢迎中国的成功。像印度、巴西之类的国家需要更好的理解中国的成功，并且向中国学习，而不要把中国妖魔化。那最后一点也是非常重要的一点，就是说虽然中国取得了巨大的经济成就，但是需要记住的是，中国目前的人均财富还是低于全球的GDP 水平的。中国跟特别是美国像之类的，像中国、像美国之类的，跟这些发达国家比，财富比例还是在1:3之间。那中国还有很长的一段路要走，在走到1:2甚至1:1的之前，必须要发展自己的，必须要保证自己的发展不会被外来的因素干扰或者阻断。Dr. Ghosh, back to you.
Thank you very much. John, I have a question for you. In times of time, we have only 15 minutes of time, but could I make it 30 minutes?
I think I expected about this situation. I would rather have you continue on and try to finish everything, if possible, by 15 or 20 minutes after 9.
Okay.
Then you have gave you approximately 20 minutes for Q&A.
Thank you very much. I'll
That's
speed up.
Fair enough. Okay, go ahead.
I think so. I think we'll speed up a little bit because now what is important to understand is the way the relationship has developed, and I would not get into it, but let me particularly focus that every 10 years, there has been a fundamental change as to how China-US engagement has taken place. Till about 70s, President Richard Nixon visited and had his first meeting with Henry Kissinger and Mao Zedong. And the purpose of the meeting was indeed to engage, not to disengage. It was to engage. And that's why the two leaders met. I think Mao Zedong and Richard Nixon had a very good meeting. And in the process, there was an agreement that the two countries will work together to help the development of China, US to find a ways to participate in China. That was a fundamental, though philosophically there was differences. Very capitalistic country, United States, very socialistic country, China. And by that time, socialism has worked. Agricultural, as we saw earlier, productivity has increased very rapidly. Education in the villages have happened. The healthcare has happened. A lot of things were achieved during that period, and China was ready to move open. And that's exactly what happened to 70s to 90s, which I would call actually the golden period. That was a golden period in the relationship because US was becoming familiar with China. China was gradually internalizing, and China, you could see the manufacturing sector emerging. Following that, in the 90s to 2010, it further got engaged. So China was viewed as a partner as well as a competitor because Chinese companies became very competitive, but it was embraced by American companies, by the European companies. You start seeing Chinese product. China joined the WTO, and then came the Oval Office, a new person in the Oval Office. He started looking at China differently, partly maybe fairly, partly unfairly, but clearly dramatically China's image, perception in the United States changed, particularly the Oval Office. It doesn't mean many American companies love TikTok, WeChat, ByteDance. So I think we have to make a distinction between what happens in Washington, D.C. versus what happens all over the world. And then came the biggest assault, which is the COVID-19. Now, you have to keep that in mind. It's a tremendous shift in the relationship, and which, as I remember in a meeting, Mr. Morita, who was the founder of Sony, I was in a meeting with him in American Chamber of Commerce in Japan. And that time, Japan was having same kind of problems which China is facing with the United States. They used to use the word trade friction. And Morita jokingly said, friction is good, but it creates energy. And if that energy is used creatively, it leads to new possibilities. And I feel the same way, that yes, China has grown up. China has grown up very rapidly. Now, obviously, there would be some points of differences, but these points of differences are good, healthy, because when differences are engaged with a strategic perspective, it leads to possibilities. Now, that's a very important point in today's discussion. Maybe Ying, you want to give a 10-second summary of the key word here.
Sure, sorry, I was on mute. Yeah. 好的，在这里，格什博士说的是，就是说中美关系，在历史上经历了不同的时代，它大概有5个不同的时代。那最近大家都知道新冠病毒进一步激化了矛盾和冲突。那他想说的是，就是说有一些华盛顿做出的，比如说是对一些公司或者对病毒的一些宣传和举动，不代表整个美国人民都是这样的一个影响。所以大家对中美关系的这个演变，还是要带有历史的眼光去看它，然后用全局观的眼光去看它。Dr. Ghosh, back to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, and as a result today, I'll go very quickly. Americans look at China as a rival, as a competitor. 50% of the Americans believe China is the biggest rival. About 22% believe Russia, North Korea, Iran, and others. But clearly, this is the image, unfortunately. And that image also differs depending upon what population we're looking at. Democrats versus Republicans, college educated versus no college educated. So as you could see, younger people, when you go to the younger population, they look at China with significantly more favorable mindset compared to older people. The Democrats look at China with significantly more positive mindset than Republicans. The key message that we have to take forward, it is complex, but the ray of hope is in the young people, how the younger generation looks at China, which is very differently from the way the older generation looks at China.
Professor,
yeah.
let me point out the other chart. I think something wrong with the translation. Unfavorable is not good, and favorable is good. Unfavorable represents the yellow, and
right.
And favorable represent the blue, but translation is just reversed. Unfortunately, and this is a very important point we have to point out.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. 这点我加一句啊，我加一句就是说，上面说呢，现在66%的整体对中国的印象不好，26%的整体对中国的印象好。民主党是62%，共和党是72%，这个没有大学的64%，上大学毕业的68%，这个18到29的53%，30到47的4967%，50以上72%。这都是对中国印象不好，那个蓝色是对中国印象好。我说一下这个，是吧？这个
Thank you.
Yeah, it was a typo, Dr. Ghosh.
Yeah, very important. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. Very important. Thank you. And obviously, I will not get into detail, particularly in the last 2 years, as the trade war accelerated, the Huawei situation, then the trade deal that went back and forth, the COVID, the closure of consulates, the ByteDance, WeChat issues, it has become very complex. It is complex, as all of us know. We would not get into it, but the situation is a bit dramatic. Now, this captures the key points that on the one side, there are several factors which US is uncomfortable with China. Now, this is actually not China's problem, but loss of manufacturing sector. It is the outsourcing that companies in United States relied on by shifting their manufacturing from United States, from other parts of the world to China. Again, it is to be appreciated as China's discipline, China's productivity, which attracted companies to invest in China, but that is now looked as discomforting. IP theft, that is something, or environmental concerns. These are the two areas which I think China have to work on. As you could see, United States government is not one side or others. Right now, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, Google are going through tremendous amount of scrutiny by the US government, as US government might scrutinize Chinese or European companies. That's the US way of doing things. So US is not taking side, but clearly Chinese companies have to be careful in terms of how to deal with knowledge, how to deal with intellectual property. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the One Belt, One Road is viewed as a geopolitical ambition, rightly or wrongly, of China. Then there are certain issues around western part of China, Hong Kong, on human rights. And then, of course, the cybersecurity. There have been cases where people felt the national security of the country has been threatened because of some hacking where the source was from China. So obviously that has created an image. At the core, I feel is some of it is irrational and uneasy, but clearly as a country becomes more and more powerful, and the first time after the First World War, there would be people, the leadership in business, in government, who would look at any country with a higher level of scrutiny. And that's natural. On the other side, China is also unhappy. You know, China feels the US government's thoughts on Hong Kong is interference with one China policy. Sometimes it's very heavy-handed, is our way or the highway. That should not, any country has its own right to choose its economic or political system. So that should not be interfered with. Claims of taking moral high grounds, unfair accusation on the narrative of COVID-19. So obviously that has been the challenge which we have to get out of. But the biggest problem is this one, you know, but that I feel is where we cannot hold China responsible. US have to do some soul searching, particularly American business schools have to do some soul searching, that instead of managing its manufacturing with a focus on productivity, many of the companies decided to outsource manufacturing to Chinese companies. And China has done a great job. And in the process, the trade balance is almost reverse, mirror image. China positive, $70.9 billion, which is about 1.9% of China's GDP. In case of United States, is exactly the same amount, but negative, which is about 1.4% of US GDP. And that has been perhaps the most important thing that Chinese and the Americans are uncomfortable with, particularly the Americans. Now, China's share of the world is almost, manufacturing is 30%. And largely, not only, but largely facilitated by the growth of the outsourcing model in the United States. And that is a US problem, not a Chinese problem, but it is viewed as a Chinese problem. And that's simply we have to correct it. And today, almost close to 1/3, for every 3 products, 1 is produced in China. And that is China's achievement. China's share of R&D has also gone up. China is spending a lot of money in research and development. Of the total research done in the world, close to 30% of the research funds are spent on China. And many of them, by the way, are American and European pharmaceutical companies, semiconductor companies, artificial intelligence companies, which are doing research in China because they're impressed with graduates coming out of universities like Peking University, from Tsinghua University. They want to have access to the talent. So we have to look at these with more positive attitude. In the process, as the tariffs have come down, these are average tariffs of the world. It used to be about 15% in 1990s, is down to 5%, which is good. Every country is bringing down the tariffs because they believe global trade is good, and indeed global exports as a percentage of GDP has increased. And this is how the tariff rates of various countries have come down. But what is very impressive, how China has brought down its tariffs. So when people say the tariffs in China are high, I think again, it's still higher than the United States. But given where China is today, if you look at the GDP per capita and look at the tariff rates of the capita, and this is the line, China is on the line. India is higher, poorer. This is the world average. This is the average tariff rate as a relative to the GDP per capita. In fact, the United States is higher above the line. If you look at Iceland, Ireland, Luxembourg, Singapore, Australia, the tariffs are significantly lower. So blue dots are developing countries like China, India, South Africa. Developed countries are orange dot. I see there's a mistake here. Sorry, this is South Africa, which is put on the developed country mode. So that is something to keep in mind, that the tariff issues also have to be looked at a bit more strategically. But the biggest challenge that I feel we are facing today, let me bring forward this chart and then I'll go to the one in Chinese, is the challenge the world is facing, the civilization is facing, that free market is somehow being challenged now. There's increasing distrust. Right in the United States, in Europe, people are saying free market is not working for the poor. The divide between the rich and poor has increased in these developed capitalistic countries. On the other side, we saw the collapse of USSR, which is the decreasing faith. But in the spirit, in the last 50 years, a new set of companies have emerged, which are neither free market nor centrally controlled. It is the Japan, particularly after the Second World War, South Korea, ASEAN countries, and more recently China, which I call strategically guided economy, is a fundamentally different economic system. It's free market, but government plays a strategic role to ensure that the free market is developing in a fashion which is good for the people of the country, which some people call state-owned capitalism, some people call conscious capitalism, some people call socialistic capitalism. And by the way, Germany and Scandinavia are also in the same mode. So the very big question that the United States is faced with vis-a-vis China, and I would say vis-a-vis many of the other countries, is the fit. Let me go to the, this is the big question. The fit between the US and the strategically guided economies. How do we accommodate it? Because it is a fact that if China wants to develop the artificial intelligence or renewable energy as the next industry, Chinese government will find a ways to encourage, support the companies which are in that space. And that's what Japan did also in the 60s and 70s. I've seen that in South Korea. And fortunately, I worked in all these countries. I could see how it happens. That support is required. Unfortunately, in the United States, that's not happening. So US perhaps have to learn, in a globalized world where technologies are very expensive, you need a long-term perspective. What should be the role of the government vis-a-vis the markets? Could you only rely on the market? Or should the role of the government be to support the market? Let me take a 30-second to Ing. 30 seconds. You have to do it in 30 seconds.
It's going to be very difficult. 这张是对我来说有点挑战。这是一个非常重要的点，就是说博士说抛开贸易、关税一些就是中美现在正在争论的问题，对两个国家来说，甚至对整个人类来说，更加矛盾中心的一个更加哲学性的问题就是这张图。就是市场和政府的关系到底是什么？当然，在美国大家都知道，信奉的是自由市场，和小政府。那 这个模式在这些年，它所带来的一些资源分配不均的问题越来越受到质疑，在美国本土也是，比如说桑德斯、AOC、沃伦这些左派政治家受欢迎的程度，就是这个证明，就是说大家渐渐对这个模式失去了信任。那右边的中央调控的模式呢，在历史上也有很多失败的例子，就不赘述了。那不是说在以中国为代表的一些国家，比如说日本、韩国、中国、新加坡，甚至德国，这些国家在这两个模式中间走出了第三条路，也就是说，国家资源在战略上引导市场，在最大的程度上同时发挥自由市场和政府的优势。我们说是把无形的手跟有形的手结合起来。那现在在美国最大的他们的 discomfort 就是说，如何在这些模式之间建立一个过渡的桥梁，实现共存，这个是中美双方都需要面对的问题，甚至全人类都需要面对的一个问题。Dr. Ghosh, back to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. So, and then on top of that, if you look at what is interesting, two of China's partners, one is United States, the other one, which is a trade partner, and the next partner is your partner next door, which is India. Both the countries, which are also democracies of the world, is having the most difficult time with COVID-19. And that has also affected the mindset of how people look at China, that China solved the problem, but it started the problem started there. And here are two democracies which are facing the biggest challenges which COVID-19 has faced. So as you could see, that we need to reconnect. And it is not too long time back in the Trump Tower when Jack Ma and Donald Trump, this picture was taken. But in the 3-4 years time, things have changed. But I strongly believe that the new world could emerge. So the next 3 points would be, how would this new world emerge? Keeping in mind, very important to keep in mind that the global dynamics is different, which is the first point. Second, there are a lot of perception problems, both on the US side as well as on China side in the relationship. And given those two, how do we create the new paradigm, which I would like to use the word enlightened paradigm, and how to, in the process, not decouple, but to find a new way to couple. So that would be my first point in the presentation. So when you look at it in the world is indeed faced with a lot of problems. There's no doubt about it. And if I really bring it down to China, US, it is the problem of 3 T's. I call the 3 T's. It is balance of trade, balance of trust, particularly focused on intellectual property, and balanced approach to technology sharing. So this is where we have to think of how do we really create a new concept of partnership focused on solving the problem. And then what is more important, if you look at China and United States together, these two countries constitutes 50% of the global economy today. So there's a lot of resources available. How do we create a plus-sum game from zero-sum game to solve some of the fundamental challenges of our times? Our times, I really mean the global. The widening gap between rich and poor, which I call the COVID divide. The free markets are not working because it is clear that the gap between rich and poor is increasing. The resource constraints of the governments, the climate and ecology constraints, and the biggest problem that I face, and that's one of the reasons that we are creating the leadership academy in IIT, is eroding ethics. So these are some serious problems across the world. Now, could China and US engage to address the top part in terms of problem solving and the bottom part to think of more enlightened approach to create what we are calling the plus sum? In English, plus sum, here it is in Chinese, how to create the new era, which is possible. And these are the typical problems. Both China and United States have one very serious problem. Mr. Mao Zedong would not like to see this chart, because the whole revolution in China was to reduce the gap between rich and poor. But now again, with China's economic rise, the gap, the y-axis is the measure of the gap between rich and poor. Higher the number, more is the gap. This is China, this is the United States. And what is more sad, in the United States, which is one of the developed countries, the gap between rich and poor is significantly higher compared to if you look at Sweden, Norway, Finland, Germany, Japan. So United States point should have been somewhere here. So US has a very serious problem. Could China and US find a way how to reduce the divides? Because both of them, one is a developing country and it has a divide. One is a developed country, there's a divide. How do we solve the divide issue? Very interesting way of looking at it. Second, the climate change. If you look at the CO2 emissions, United States is very high, China is rising very rapidly. What could we do? And secondly, a third, dependence on fossil fuel. Both the countries are dependent on fossil fuel. How do we get into new energy? So these are the kinds of areas with a tremendous possibility to work together to see how we solve the problem. The other problem that worries me the most is the problems of infectious diseases. I don't know whether you realize the number of diseases, infectious diseases, have been in the rise. This is 1940, this is 1990s, this is part of 2000. But clearly the number of diseases have been rising. We're living in a more connected world. So the world is exposed to this problem. The two areas which are most exposed are the deep red areas, which is China and India, which are neighbors. Now, how again could US and China come together to look at the world and say, how do we solve the problem of infectious diseases? COVID-19 is just an example of that problem. And then the other problem is the healthcare of the world. This is a very interesting chart. What we are looking at is the y-axis, the degree of preparedness of healthcare system of the world, that how prepared are we? So more higher you are, more prepared the countries are, like Russia, Germany, Japan, and South Korea. And this is the degree of vulnerability. How vulnerable is a population, which is, by the way, is a function of population density and the age of the population. So more dense and more aged the population is, more vulnerable they are. So if you are on the 45-degree line, is fine. That means you are more vulnerable and you are more prepared. So Japan, South Korea, Germany are fine. Russia has got a surplus, if you will. They are very well prepared compared to the vulnerability. China is also on the 45-degree line. But these are the countries. United States have a problem, actually. India is definitely a very serious problem. Indonesia, United Kingdom, these are the areas. So again, to look at these problems and see what we could do. And obviously there are a lot of different measures that United States and China could take together. So now let me step back and see, what does it all mean? And I look at it from two different vectors. One vector I will call from the corporate vector. The companies can continue as is, or talk about fundamental adjustment. I'm talking about small, medium-sized, and big companies like Huawei and Haier, and Lenovo, and Sinopec. So it's small or medium or large, doesn't matter. One is to choose, well, we are done fine, we'll continue as is. Another one is to say, the world is changing, we have to make fundamental adjustment. This axis is a government policy axis. China, given the uncertainties in the world, could retaliate, which fortunately China has not in the last 6 months, or take a holistic approach. So depending upon how the Chinese policymaking apparatus reacts to the changes that are taking place in the world, in the US-China relationship, and how the corporates change, it would shape the future. So the question is, which quadrant do we want to be? And obviously, as a humble problem solver, as a servant to humanity. If we are in this quadrant, we are intensifying the Cold War. It will not help anyone. It will not help Chinese companies. It will not help China. It will not help the world. And this could be a dangerous place to be. I call it the Armageddon. We don't want to be there. We have to get out of it. And that's why Professor Yang has organized this seminar, and we'll have series of such seminars with China and United States in the next 1 year or so. On the other side, if we can get here with Chinese policymaking takes a holistic step back approach, the Oval Office is going to change in the next 2 days. The sentiments, some of the sentiments in America are valid, many of them are invalid. We will change the perception. That's the government's approach. The companies fundamentally say that, look, the way we have developed in the last 20 years and the way we need to develop in the next 10 years, we have to make fundamental adjustment. That is what I'm calling the enlightened era. And that is very possible. And I would really encourage both the policymakers, if there are anyone in the audience today, or we can take it, John Young, you could take it to the government, the Beijing government, and have a chat. How do we create this era compared to being here? And this shift is most important. But then I would also encourage that, look, it may not be easy for the government of China to quickly change, but there could be a corporate-led de-escalation, where Chinese companies make extraordinary effort to realize they are like Amazon, like Facebook, being challenged by the US government as they are challenged. So we have to learn how to deal with the new world and make fundamental adjustments. And I personally feel that's possible. Or it could be government-led de-escalation, where the government in Beijing start engaging with European Union, with India, with the United States, with a different formula. That is also possible. So ideal case is green, which I think is in the realm of possibility. But if the government takes time to react, definitely the private sector, the companies like Huawei, Haiers, and Lenovo's, and they could make the fundamental adjustment to move from this territory to this territory, which I think is definitely achievable. Now, maybe Ying, you can give a 5-second summary.
Yeah, I think we're running out of time, Dr. Ghosh, so we need to speed up it. So I'll do quickly. 对，在这一章上，Ghosh 博士说是未来到底有哪些可能性，纵轴就代表了企业可以做的事情，就是企业一方面可以说 OK， 世界在改变，我们也需要做根本上的调整。还有一方面，企业可以说 OK， 我们一直以来都很成功，所以不需要做出任何改变。那横轴代表的是政府的应对，往右边的话，政府可以更加激进的模式对待这个世界，那在左边的话是一个比较全面性的温和的角度去对待这个世界，那最坏的可能性呢，可能就是右下角，就是红色这一块，就是说会面对一个新一轮的冷战。那最好的可能性就是左上角，政府和企业共同努力，到一个开明的时代。那其实我们作为在这两个场景之间还有2个场景，一个就是以企业为代表的做出改变，让摩擦降级，还有一个就是以政府为代表的做出领导做出决定，让摩擦降级。那我们作为咨询公司在国内其实一直跟企业打交道，我们深信就是至少右上角是完全可行的，但是要达到绿色的这个场景呢，则需要政府和企业的共同努力。Dr. Ghosh, back to you.
Thank you. So since we are running out of time, I'll just use 2 exhibits. One thing to keep in mind, that as businesses want to make change, Chinese companies should understand there are fundamentally 8 strategic advantages China enjoys vis-a-vis any part of the world. And if used in a responsible fashion as partners of the world, not just as competitors of the world, it could open up a major strategic advantage. And keeping in mind that China is already heavily engaged with the United States. This is the investments China has made in the United States. These are the various industries, including real estate and hospitality. It has organized several IPOs, which means Chinese companies have raised money from the United States through IPOs, and China have participated actively through mergers and acquisitions in the United States. On the other side, US companies are also heavily involved in China. As you could see, Apple, 22% of their revenues comes from China. For Skyworks, it's 71% of revenues, of global revenues come from China. For Broadcom, which is a semiconductor company, 54%, Texas Instruments. So both the countries are important to each other, particularly when I look from my clients in the United States point of view. They're looking at access to 1.4 billion consumers, access to emerging technologies, given or many new technologies that are emerging rapidly into China, and of course, access to talent. Needless to say, graduates from Peking University, Tsinghua University are tremendous attraction to the world. So that leads to me, the final point. I'll go very quickly. This is the only chart I'll use, which is very, very important. Now, Chinese companies have developed very rapidly in the last 25 years. And this is something very important to keep in mind. I've looked at companies' life cycle. A startup happens, then companies expand, then they mature, then they go global. So most of the American and European companies, which has become multinationals, when we talk about 3M, we talk about Boeing, we talk about General Motors, Ford, GE, Siemens from Europe, Philips from Europe, they followed basically this path. Over 50 years, 30 to 50 years time, they became global companies. So the learning process was 50 years. Japanese companies did the same thing in 15 to 20 years. But for Chinese companies, think of Huawei. You know, we talk about Huawei, or higher. In last 10 or 15 years, from being purely domestic companies, they're emerging as a global. So this is a very important point in mind. The China's companies, management, leadership has to learn techniques, tools, frameworks, problem-solving capacity, which US and European companies have learned in 50 years in a period of 10 to 15 years. And that is perhaps the biggest challenge the private sector or the businesses in China will face. And I'll move forward, and in a space where the world is becoming more complex. When the European and American companies developed, the number of variables, the degree of complexity of the world was significantly less. So Chinese companies have to learn faster in a world which is significantly more complex. And that's a very important point to keep in mind. Speed of learning in a world which is significantly more complex, significantly more fuzzy, and significantly changing rapidly, and being scrutinized. So what we are saying that we have to develop multiple disciplines. I would have spent a lot of time in discussing this. Maybe in the next session we'll do that. That there are literally 5 different dimensions. Sorry, we're looking at 6 different dimensions on which Chinese companies have to develop. It's strategic discipline, market intelligence, a number of areas we have to develop very rapidly. And these are where I think much of the effort of Chinese companies should be focused on. And in the process, ensure that you develop a dynamic capacity to differentiate, whether it's a cost advantage, whether it's a brand advantage, whether it's a technology advantage, whether it's a reach network advantage, or its relationship with the customer, particularly in B2B space. How do we manage these different strategic advantages depending upon where in the life cycle your business is would be extremely important. So I will pass these exhibits. There were some examples from Japan. Japan has done it, but this would be the challenge of the businesses in the 21st century, all multinational, particularly for Chinese companies, because most of the advantage has been on the basis of delta C, delta cost. But soon as China becomes richer, becomes part of the global economic system, we have to think of what are the other advantages the Chinese company must take advantage of. So I'll keep in mind that as you think of the future of the company, Chinese companies have to really think of how to be the most attractive player in the globe from the point of view of investors, suppliers, place to work, and from the point of view of customer. So this is where Ying and her team is very committed to see that these premiums, I'm using the word strategic premiums, get built into Chinese companies. And that's not a minor change. We are talking about a fundamental shift. And in doing so, this is perhaps summarizes it very well, that if this is the nature of change that is taking place in the world, this is the key factors for success. What are the new skill sets that Chinese companies have to develop? And this assumes that the world is going to be very different. The way to succeed would be very different. As a result, companies have to develop the capacity to develop new types of skill sets. That's one thing that we at Quantum Logic are very committed to develop, work with you to develop. These are fundamentally different, but they have to be developed very, very rapidly. And in the process, make some fundamental transition in terms of how organizations should work. This is the past, this is the future. Past, future. And as you could see, whether you're talking about innovation and particularly managing relationship with government, many companies, including US and European, Japanese companies, used to have adversarial relationship with government. Right now, Amazon and Facebook and Apple are struggling with the US government. But the challenge, if that is the role of the government, antitrust, fairness, so companies have to learn how to deal with governments, how to be market oriented, and how to have an organizational model which is not nearly hierarchical, but significantly more network. In fact, Haier is doing a lot of interesting experiments in the name of Rendai model. I think we would like to see how to develop that model into the 21st century. So the big message is we have to move from the left-hand side, which has been mechanistic, transactional, to holistic and relational. And that is a big shift. It looks simple, but we are talking about a philosophical shift to take place. And to do so, I would not get into the details. I'm speeding up a little bit, that companies have to embrace the future with this different sets, as you could see, from open mind to thinking about flexibility in relationship, how to work with partners, how to bring analytical rigor. And that's one thing where we are focused on, how to bring that rigor. That's why the name of the firm is Quantum Logic, to bring analytical understanding of the quantum changes. That leads to the last point. And maybe, Ying, you want to summarize quickly?
Sure. 刚才这个章节，博士主要讲的是几个点，一个是就是说，中国企业在未来的5到10年会遇到非常多的挑战，大部分西方的企业，包括日本的企业，他们全球化进程大概花了在西方的这个大概是50多年，然后日本花了大概25年，15到25年的时间实现了从本土化到全球化的扩展。那中国企业在中国企业身上的这个进程，这个时间点呢被更加的压缩。那中国企业的核心领导层需要学会非常多的新的技能，不管是组织结构、创新流程和当地政府搞好关系，都是需要新的要学习的技能。同时呢，中国企业必须要掌握新的竞争优势。在过去10到15年，中国企业最大的竞争优势是集中在成本这一块上。那接下来怎么扩展这个竞争优势，真正的成为国际化的全球的大企业，是至关重要的。对，这个也是我们公司在国内做咨询业务时候经常和企业强调的最重要的一点。Dr. Ghosh, back to you.
Yes. So the final point, I'll just take 2 minutes very rapidly. To make this transition, which we are talking about a fundamental shift, it would not be easy. It would need, we have to manage multiple points of inflection. And that's why the big point is we need a different forward-looking leadership. And let me quickly summarize what does it mean. Much of the last, but both in the United States, China, I've seen that in Japan, many of the relationship has been very narrow. We take it case by case. We look at through our own lenses. We look at in name of transaction. What is the price of IP? Should we negotiate? Should we get it free? What should be the tariff? Which is basically a source of negative energy. It gets suffocating. There's multiple channels working in cross purposes. So we have to move from this mode. And I'm not talking only about Chinese companies. I'm talking about as problem solvers, how we have to make a shift from this mode to this mode, where people will learn how to work with a broadened vision, with expanded range, and in the process bring positive energy as opposed to negative energy. And that's one of the reasons, again, the Leadership Academy at IIT has been created. So now if you look at most of the Chinese companies, these has been the typical skills. And obviously the companies have done extremely well. But they're very important, necessary. But in the new environment, all of a sudden we are faced with situations where we need a series of new set of skills to deal with international advocacies, to deal with national political expectations, particularly when you're dealing with 140 countries or even 10 countries. The political expectations are different. Regulatory requirements are different. The antitrust laws are different. Unions are different. And this changeover from the purple to this light blue in Chinese companies happened in the last 10 years. It's not easy. And that's where I think the biggest challenges many of the Chinese companies have felt, and how to expand that. In other words, how to develop this set of skills. I'm going a bit rapidly. And that leads to my last chart, that we are indeed reached a point. If we look at these two measures, value added per capita, which determines the value of a country, resources committed per capita, which determines how we are developing the human resources of a country or for the world, I think we have reached a limit. China is almost hitting a limit. So China has to find a new S-curve, new curve. And the question is, how do we manage this transition? And to manage this transition, I'm talking about three kinds of fundamental shifts: philosophical shift as to how companies should engage with the world, a fundamental renovation of business models, and most importantly, leadership development in view of what we're saying. And that is what I think is the challenge of recoupling with the world, not decoupling, with a strategic mindset. And then I would like to obviously thank you very much. I'm sorry that it took longer time, because it's a very important subject. As you could see, a lot of possibilities ahead, but equally challenging would be the nature of changes that we have to make to move from the past paradigm, the 20th century paradigm, to 21st century. We are just about 20 years in, 8 years to go, and the next 10 years to make the changes. So with that, I would like to pass it on to John. Thank you very much. I'm sorry that I'm 30 minutes over time, but given the subject, it would be unfair to the nature of the problem if I did not spend the right amount of time. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. Thank you for your excellent presentation tonight. It's pretty much like a very well thought lecture on international politics and international relationships, and involving a lot of different subjects. You really need systematic thinking to make the preparation, and I thank you very much for your wonderful preparation and for your thorough knowledge on some of these complex international and global issues. There are many questions. I will be just actually selecting something that's likely to be interesting. And the first type of question, about 5-6 people have raised it, and I wonder whether it's likely to be convenient for you to answer the question, is about the election that's coming in a couple of days. the question is most likely to be who is likely to be winning based on your personal opinion. Question number one. The second type of question related to that issue is who, if actually some president gets elected, okay, whether Joe Biden or Donald Trump, okay, stay there, and the other party or the other, people with the other opinion or political views are likely to be not happy. And a lot of reports have been saying something's going to happen in the United States. And what's your expectation? What's going to happen?
Very good. It is obviously a good question, valid question, given where we are today. On the first one, between the election, firstly, I like to underscore there's all the polls that we are looking at basically is pointing towards Vice President Biden to become the next president. However, having said that, I recall in 2016, the polls were kind of suggesting that Miss Hillary Clinton would be in the Oval Office, but it did not happen that way. So my suspicion is that this time the polls would, as they have indicated, would perhaps still tilt towards Biden, but who knows? So obviously I didn't answer your question, but if I have to bet today, and if I have $10 in my pocket, I'll put $8 on Biden. So that's the first part. And the second part is a very important one. Is a very important one is a lesson that democracy only works when people can understand the responsibility that comes with democracy. The people, we say the people's country, the nation, we the people. But unfortunately, the way the politics have emerged in the last, I would say, almost 10 years, but definitely in the last 4 years, that I see that we the people, that concept with which comes tremendous amount of responsibility, a tremendous amount of caring for each other, that has been challenged. And it is in the process challenge the value of democracy. I've seen that in India for years, that democracy is a very costly process, very painful process, and always a certain segment becomes unhappy. Whatever it is, they become unhappy. Now, if that unhappiness could be contained in a civilized way, it would be good, but chances are that we might see some disruption. But this disruption would only happen if the results are very close, if it is 48-52. But if the Biden could win by a factor of, let's say, 70-30 or 60-40, then I think America would act in a responsible fashion. But I must say, this underscores that time has come as we have to think beyond capitalism, beyond socialism, as we are calling the nextism, Xism, or what I call strategically guided economy. Similarly, I think democracy is a new concept. It developed only in the last 200 years after the Constitution of the United States was written, 250 years. Before that, the United Kingdom. But maybe there's a new need for a new political process also. And I think because we are living in a very different world where everything is transparent, everything is in social media, people get angry very quickly. Given that, could democracy sustain as we have known in the last 250 years is a very important question the world has to answer. So that's where my point of view.
Thank you very much, Professor. The second type of question is about is related to the issue of recoupling and decoupling issue, okay? And this is a very important issue that's been paid a lot of attention to by the Chinese here in China, based on my interaction with them, okay? And a lot of people have become very pessimistic about the current situation. So one question asks you, if we would love very much to re-establish the recoupling between China and the United States, and China and the rest of the world, particularly the English-speaking countries and the major English-speaking countries, how possible it is and under what conditions you will be able to achieve that goal, as you have said in your presentation?
Yeah, that's a very question. I personally feel extremely positive, but I have to give you a bit of an elaborate answer why. As you know, I spent about 15 years of my life in Japan, actually 16 years to be more exact, when Japan was going through the boom, exactly similar to what China is going through right now. It was between 1980 to 1996. And during that period, I noticed that how Japan struggled to change from becoming hardcore manufacturing country to becoming a country which could exert its soft power. So I think if Chinese companies, medium-sized, big, large, focuses on not only selling and focused on the hard power, but start focusing on the soft power, that we want to become trusted partners of our customers, our suppliers, our partners, and in the process engage with the world with a different formula, which is we are a global company. I always used to say to Japanese company, do not be Nihonjin, be Sekaijin. Nihonjin means Japanese company should not be viewed as Japanese company. They should be viewed as a global company, that we are part of the globe. So happens with our headquarters is in Beijing or Shanghai or Shenzhen or Tokyo, doesn't matter, we are a global company. If that transition could be made, I think China has got a tremendous role to play, because mind you, China is like India, 500 years ago was an economy which enjoyed a tremendous stature. Now, if we regain that stature, the big question would be, how do we play a role in the globe as equal partners of progress with the full humility to serve, If hundreds of Chinese companies, and that's why I'm very encouraged to work with you and with Ying and many other partners we have in China to help Chinese companies make that transition. If we do not make that transition, then John, your question is very valid. What will happen to the future of Chinese companies? They will get marginalized. They will be viewed as pure companies from China as opposed to viewed as global companies headquartered in China. And there's a big difference between the two.
Thank you very much. Related to that question, and which actually wants to make a better understanding between China and the United States. This is a question raised by an academic person doing research on US-China relations. He said, actually, from your perspective, what is your suggestion on both academics in both countries? To what extent they are able to exert influence on government policies towards the other country? And how do you comment as a scholar in the United States about the US scholars on China? Okay.
That's a very brilliant question. I feel, I have to step back a little bit. I am a member of a nonprofit organization called the Boston Pledge. The name is the Boston Pledge. And the reason it was set up is to play the role that you just mentioned. I hope it is in the long term, my members of the Boston Pledge would understand that there are some issues which the academic world could work together. So if I am at Tufts or Harvard or MIT, I work with PKU to take on and take a point of view, not as a part of a country, but part of a globe. And this is how we see the climate issue has to be tackled. This is how we see infectious disease issue has tackled. So there is no flavor or color of any country. There is a flavor of the world. Now, unfortunately, United Nations and I would say ILO and World Bank, which are set up to play that role, was, I would have to say honestly, they could not play that role, partly because their agendas are driven by people who are funding them. But at independent universities like, MIT, I find, MIT does not, I can speak for MIT and Tufts and Harvard, these three universities I interact very regularly with. They do not have any agenda as far as the country is concerned. So if Peking University and Harvard or Tsinghua and MIT, or an organization like Boston Pledge, which John, I would like to invite you to join, they work on such issues, or the Leadership Academy at IIT Kharagpur works on such issues, I think we can create exactly what we are talking about, where the academic world takes leadership. I think it's a very dear point to me, because what has happened in the last 30 years, I've noticed, the academic world has become servant to the marketplace. They try to create students so they could be sold. As opposed to, if you look back to the olden days of Oxford and Cambridge, or if I go farther back, the olden days of Nalanda and Taxila, which used to be in India, the focus was not how to sell our students, focus on how to advance the future thinking of the world, how to advance the thinking of humanity. I think we have to go back to that. We always say, oh, how the salaries, the universities measure their success. Our graduates, when they graduate, their salary is X dollars. That's why it's a good university. I don't think so. A good university is one which can accelerate the pace of thinking on the frontier issues of the world, and universities have to play that role. So I can go on, but I think you're absolutely right. The role of the scholars are very important. They should have the courage to speak up on global issues as partners of the world, not representing any country. And that's where I would like to talk to you about Boston Pledge sometime. That's what we believe we have to do as global citizens.
Okay, thank you very much. Following this particular question is one question that related to the misunderstanding of the United States and other countries on China. In your presentation, this person said, in your presentation, you said China needs to understand the misunderstanding of China abroad. My question is, the international community misunderstood which part of the Chinese situation? And if you go deeper to the reasons or factors affecting these reasons, I would highly appreciate.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think the international community understands two or three things a bit differently. One is there's a strong feeling that any system different from the Western Anglo-Saxon political system, any system different from the Western Anglo-Saxon economic system is not good. And that has to be corrected. I think the Western world has to learn that there could be multiple systems at work. Every country has the right to choose their own system. And at the same time, every country's responsibility is to work with international laws. So when I am in Rome, I should do as the Romans do. It's an old saying. So when Chinese companies are operating in United States, follow the laws, follow the rules, be it intellectual property, be it the tariffs, whatever it is, which I feel Chinese companies have done. But whenever US companies has faced competition from Chinese companies, olden days, 30 years ago from Japanese companies, it was viewed, it is a problem of Japan. It is a problem of China because it was very difficult for many Western companies' leaderships to accept that given that the Western world, with the British Empire, then the American growth, the German, it was very difficult to adjust to Asian ways of doing things. So it is the responsibility now of Japanese, South Korean, Chinese, Taiwanese companies, because they are very global, very successful, to make the Western world understand there is a room for another system. There's a way to compete. We compete with a different set of rules, but at the same time, we respect your rules. So I think that is where I think Chinese companies' leadership has to play a bit more holistic rule, holistic approach, holistic role in engaging with the world outside. Okay. And the other question is, as I mentioned, the leaders of the United States, yesterday I was watching, day before yesterday, the CEO of Starbucks. Starbucks was very positive on China. And he was very appreciative how Chinese government dealt with COVID-19, how the new post-COVID world is opening up. And he did mention that this time has come for US companies to learn from China, as opposed to when China is different, the attitude has been, well, they're not doing something right. So I think this ability to learning from each other, and particularly given that China has done so well in the last 30 years, I can bet there's a lot of things to learn, but China has to package it. See, this is where my frustration is. When I was living in Japan, I had one of the desire I had to create Japan as a model for the rest of the world. But unfortunately, Japanese companies remain to be Japanese. My goal was to make them from Japanese to global. I used to call Nihonjin kara Sekaijin. If you understand Japanese, and Ing understands Japanese. Nihonjin kara Sekaijin. That transition didn't happen. But I think I like to see China makes that transition. If that happens, we will create a new world. Because mind you, we are indebted to the West. Everything that we have today is electricity, steam engine, internet, biotech, all came from Western Europe and the extension of Western Europe, which is North America. Now time has come for the eastern part of the world to contribute in a humble fashion, in the soft power, and in the process create a different kind of harmony in the global economic system.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, the last question is related to this one, and because we still have many questions, but there's no time, unfortunately. And this question also about the relationship between China and the United States in particular. Basically, it's between the perception of the masses of people on both sides currently under a pretty unfavorable perception based on your presentation. Over 2/3 of the people in the United States, and I don't have any data here in China, okay? But under what situation do you think this particular perceptive situation will be reversed in the future? Make some prediction.
Okay, that's a very good point. I would suggest there are 3 things we could do. And I'm personally taking the responsibility because I think it's easy to say government should do this, company should do this. Let me take the personal responsibility that I, as a member of the world, what could I do? One is, John, I would love to work with you to have many such seminars. Because you made a very good point earlier on. What is the role of universities? What is the role of thought leaders? The role of thought leader, consultants, problem solver, that we can objectively present the situation. And I think we have to need some mechanism how to educate both the American public and the Chinese public. I made today's presentation, which I made to the university students at Tufts about one month ago. And they loved it. But they sent me emails saying, Partha, you have changed our mind. We didn't have that perception. So I think we have to broadcast a presentation like this very actively. That's point one. That's where I personally would like to work with you and work with Ing and QLC to create that new ferment. Point two, I think, given your connections, I know you're very well connected with the Chinese government. without mentioning any specific names, but the individuals that you know, if we could set up a way to create a dialogue that, look, how could China, because United States played a very important role after the war to give shape to the modern economic system, by creating United Nations, the World Bank, IMF, a lot of institutions got created and opened up the world. Then John Kennedy created the Peace Corps. Remember the Peace Corps, John Kennedy, the man on the moon. Now time has come. What is the equivalent thing China could do? What is equivalent of Peace Corps that China could do, not to promote the interest of China? It should not be perceived that way, but to promote the interest of our civilization. So it has to play, and that's why Japan missed an opportunity. Japan had a tremendous opportunity in late 80s, early 90s, and then Japanese economy collapsed. But that opportunity was lost. China should not lose this opportunity, momentum. And the third thing, I think, as I mentioned, I think we have to have many similar dialogues with Chinese companies. Maybe we could create a forum with people like Mr. Zhang of Haier, or a forum of 100 top CEOs should meet once a quarter to talk about these issues. And I would like to offer myself so that we could see how the companies could engage with different parts of the world with different formula. That is required, because not that they cannot think on their own, but they're so busy running their companies. There's a need for an outside force which could say that, look, as you are running, how do you think about the future differently? And I feel that did not happen in Japan. And what happened also, is a very touching point you made, John, because the leaders of Japan who built Japan, who were there? Mr. Morita, Mr. Inomori, Mr. Matsushita, Soichiro Honda, Konosuke Matsushita, I mentioned, Mr. Omran Tateishi, all of them at the same time passed away. They built up these companies, they passed away. They lived long. Mr. Morita is no longer there. Mr. Soichiro Honda is not there. Konosuke Matsushita is not. But that created a tremendous vacuum in the Japanese corporate world. I hope that doesn't happen in Chinese corporate world. When I look at the founders of Huawei, Haier, Lenovo, Alibaba, Jack Ma, Peter Ma, and all these individuals who have created this ecosystem, I think the next generation have to be developed to create the next phase of China's growth. So there's a lot of lessons to be learned from Japan. That success, unless followed by a new formula, success is very difficult to sustain. And I could have a very long discussion on this. This is something very dear to my heart. I dedicated myself, I would say almost 30 years of my life, because that's why I was in Japan, with the hope that Japan would be able to offer a new model. But unfortunately, now China cannot afford to lose that opportunity. And China is significantly more bigger, significantly more wider, significantly more diverse to play that role with the world.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor, for your excellent presentation and for your excellent response to quite a few questions. And I have selected about 2/3 of questions. There's still many questions, but I think we don't have time this time. It's already 10 o'clock in Beijing in the evening, and 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock. Is it 9 o'clock?
I think 9 o'clock.
9 o'clock, 9 o'clock, okay, 1 hour late. Okay.
We have our breakfast time.
Yeah. 于伟，我们现在是不是可以就是最后我简单点评一下？
好啊，有请你来。
Professor Ghosh, let me ask a question here. Since I don't know how many people in the audience are speaking English, and is it convenient for me to make the final presentation in Chinese, or you rather prefer my speaking English? That's going to be
No,
fine.
I think I'll prefer it in Chinese because most of our discussion happened in English. I could see a lot of my good friends from Germany, England. Let me see what I have. Then maybe Ying could make a summary in English. Let's play the double role.
Sure.
Is that fair enough? Ying?
Yeah.
那我就这样，因为because the way I speak Chinese much quicker and faster.
I know.
Okay, very good. Okay. 我呢，各位这个今天晚上的听众啊，特别感谢你们到今天晚上这么晚的时间，还来听这个我们教授的啊，这个 Pasa 教授的讲演。我个人觉得呢，这个教授的讲演在今天晚上11月这个1号的晚上啊，在美国大选前的2天来做这个讲演，极具重要性啊。它这个重要性呢，实际上呢，给我们客观的分析了今天的这个中美之间的关系，也客观的解读了我们在这个整个过程之中，在世界上遇到的很多的挑战啊，这些挑战涉及到方方面面，我就不讲了。但是我个人觉得呢，这个 Pasa 他今天讲演给我最大的一个体会，就是他不是从纯粹的技术的角度啊去讲中国应该发生的变化，或者是美国应该发生的变化，更重要的是他从领导力的角度，从新的这种这个 business model 的角度，从世界跨文化沟通的角度，真正的构出了一幅就是今后中国企业往外走啊，或者是美国企业到中国去啊，中国的企业还有中国的国家，包括政府和国外的企业沟通之间应该注意的事项。他不仅讲到了这个技术层面，还讲到了很多的，我觉得特别是在最后的一点讲到了哲学的层面，包括 leadership change、philosophical change as well the model。那么这一点呢，我个人觉得我特别的欣赏。那么我就想起了2017年以色列，我们带着学生到以色列去啊，以色列的总统佩雷斯在7月份啊，大概见了我们之后呢，大概两周就去世了啊。当时他说的话，我现在记忆犹新，而且我曾经写了一篇短文呢，也写出这句话。他当时在2017年的时候 ，2017， the Paris of the Israeli president told our students that in the future, the world will only be strongly affected by 2 countries. Remember, this is 2017, okay? That is China and the United States. Then he said, the understanding between the 2 countries are extremely important. You should not compete on something, hardware, but you should compete on how your country will be able to improve the livelihood of the people and how the 2 countries will be able to be working together. I still remember this. I say this in English. Okay. 那么呢，在这个时候呢，我自己想到了今天这个 Pasa 讲的这件事情啊，对我们整个今天的听众来讲极为重要。就中美的关系不是简单中美的关系，中美的关系是涉及到世界和平，而且是很重要的一个关系。因为中国和美国是世界第1大和第2大经济大国啊，在政治上也有很大的影响。那么我今天听到的第三个感悟呢，就是 Pasa 讲到了新冠疫情之后的世界变得尤为的复杂，而且他讲到了现在世界在某种意义上反全球化、民粹主义、民族主义、经济下滑，或者是老百姓的这种绝望啊、失望的绝望，在世界上我们都看到了。所以从这个角度上来讲呢，中美之间的相互的依赖、相互的合作，中国和美国的知识分子在这个过程中相互的这种影响，能够影响整个的公共舆论，让2个国家的人民、2个国家的政府之间有更多的这种这个 understanding with one another is very, very critical， 这很重要的。那么我呢，今天呢，我刚才想讲，因为我用中文讲的一个重要的目的， 我就觉得呢，就是今天 Pastor 讲了很多的内容，我们需要消化，但是他呢，实际上给我们每一个人提出了重大的挑战啊。我自己列了这个挑战，我列的比较多啊，就是在边写的时候边听的时候我就列挑战。Pastor, I will put the emphasis on explaining the major challenges lying ahead, particularly for Chinese companies.
Absolutely.
我觉得挑战第一就是我觉得就是企业家应该具备一个什么样的这个责任，什么样的诚信和什么样的信仰，能够让中国的企业家到国外去，不仅仅这个能够卖产品，更重要的是这个能够呢有很多的怎么说呢，在这过程中有很多的他的这种精神影响到世界。第二点呢，就是挑战呢，就中国的企业家采用什么样的方式和方法，能够在整个这个过程之中提高我们企业家本身的全球视野跨文化情商这个我跟我的合作伙伴王老师就专门讲的这个跨文化情商，能够真正的把这种情商这个传递到国外就第一条是价值观和信任和诚信第二条就是国际视野，跨文化的这个情商这一点对中国企业来讲很重要。第三件事情呢，就是我们应该看到这一点 Pastor 讲了，没有多讲，我简单的讲一下，就是技术和人性之间的关系现在我们都开始强调机器人机器代替人强调 AI 等等，强调所有这一些，但是在新的这种人文环境下，中国和美国这个企业也好，政府也好，社会也好，怎么能够真正解决人和技术之间的问题？怎么能够在人和技术之间，人的思维永远占主动性，而人永远不会变成机器机器可能越来越像人，而人在这个整个过程中，怎么能够在一个机器的社会中更加保持我们的人性，更加让我们每一个人有积极的主动的这种态度来对待这个世界。那么第四个挑战呢，就是大学的教育的挑战。这个挑战今天呢，这个谁Pastor 没有讲，因为昨天晚上我开了一个会，开得很晚，也是一个国际会议。这个挑战是一个哈佛大学教授，他呢是真正的这个艺术系的终身教授，来自中国。他说呢，现在很遗憾的是，大家都讲 AI， 但是大家对人文、社会人文，特别是 liberal arts college， 我们管它叫博雅科学，几乎都放弃了。在哈佛大学的很多的人文教授教社会人文、哲学理念、社会学、心理学、哲学的这些教授，他们的选修课在班上呢，以前都有几十个人、几百个人，现在有的班就1个到2个人，大家都去这个学习技术学习算术，学习 AI， 学习金融，学习那些能够给他们找到工作的人。那么这个现象，我个人认为不仅仅在这个美国出现了，我觉得在中国也出现了。因为在疫情情况下，以及在今天经济人文情况下，我们现在的找工作越来越难，因此教育里面如何把这件事情做好也很麻烦。所以那个哈佛的叫 Eugene Dr. 汪教授，他说了一件，他说我们不仅仅应该有 AI， 我们应该用另外一个叫做 Artificial Intelligence。他说呢，我们应该他的实验室要创造一个叫 Artful Intelligence， 因为领导力本身并不是科学，它是艺术。领导力本身涉及到全人类的生存问题、哲学问题、生死问题、道德伦理问题，这些东西机器都不能改变。因此他们在哈佛大学准备做一些这方面的实验，让更多的人针对现在整个社会，美国社会所遇到的这些人文和机器之间的这种冲突，机器和经济之间的冲突，就业穷人和富人之间的冲突里面，从人性、从哲学、从理念、从信仰、从心理这方面来去认真的探讨这些问题，因为机器永远解决不了这些问题。我觉得第5个挑战呢，就是教育。中国的教育变得尤为的重要， 在今天人文环境下，如何增加这个人力资本啊、社会资本或者是心灵资本，对中国的教育来讲变得尤为的重要。我们今天Pasa 讲的所有这些事情，中国企业也讲海外去哈，关键在于人才。如果我们没有人才，那么我们很难在海外成功。但是我们没有教育，没有教育工作者，没有真正懂国际事务的这个教育工作者，不能真正的把今天世界上最珍贵的知识传达给我们的学生，从小学到中学到大学的这教育工作者，我们是不可能真正的战胜这个挑战的。第5个挑战就是国家和企业怎么样把硬实力和软实力很好的结合在一起，融合在一起。今天这个 Pasa 专门讲了这一条，就在最后他讲的比较快，但我注意到了，他讲就是说国家不仅应该有硬实力啊，硬实力就包括经济啊，包括高速公路，包括铁路，包括马路啊，包括我们所有的基础设施，还应该有软实力，就是价值观，我们的这种思想、哲学、理念，企业到外面去，不仅仅涉及到这个企业的这个硬实力，更重要的是能够用自己的软实力，用自己的新的商业模式，用自己的新的哲学理念和思想，去真正的到世界上这个施加影响。那么第7个挑战呢，就是巴瑟讲的自由市场经济与这个中央集权控制模式之间，不是替代的问题，而是妥协的问题。这个挑战，我个人觉得呢，在今天的中国，在今天的美国，在今天的欧洲，在今天的西欧福利国家都遇到了。在我最近一直在看的一本书《新加坡的整个历史》中啊，如何解决这个问题很重要，特别是疫情之后，就是国家的作用，国家的这种中央这种怎么说呢？集中权力来应对这种应对这种整个的这个出现的这些问题这种方式，以及怎么能够在企业运作时候，在疫情好了恢复经济之后，把自由市场的经济，特别是民营企业的经济进一步的发扬光大下去，这是一个很重要的挑战。而这种妥协在世界上已经证明了，没有一种模式可以完全成功，必须在这个问题上进行妥协和有力的协调。第8个挑战就是帕瑟所讲的，美国在某种意义上比中国还厉害，和中国在经济发展过程中都取得了伟大的成就，但是两极分化极为的危险，两极分化极为的这个重大。因此在这个过程中，我们采用什么样的方式能够把这个我们讲的这个Gini coefficient这个字这个东西给降下去，能够像有些国家，像北欧国家这样，把这个两极分化的现象给它能够治理一下这个治理的方式和方法极为的这个挑战我们肯定是不能用一些比较这个重的方法，但是这里面需要的是智慧第9个挑战就是中国一定要进行深入的改革。这个改革，我个人觉得从 Pasa 最后讲的这一点，这个改革第1条就是要有真正的哲学思想理念的转变这个商业模式的创新也很重要如果我们采用以前的形式，企业又大又这个决策权呢又多层次无法让企业里面的员工受到这个重大的积极性，那么我们就是不行的。所以国有企业要改革，民营企业也要改革，跨国公司在中国的这种人文环境下也要改革，制度的改革一定要伴随着哲学思想的改革，也就是文化的改革那么最后就是我就想说一下呢，就是 Pasa 在最后的讲演中讲到了世界级企业所应该具备的素质。中国的企业现在很多企业已经进入了世界500强，已经有1半的企业这个跟美国企业差不多了甚至超过。但是呢，真正的成为世界级的企业，包括它的战略、它的架构、它的人的积极性、它的这种投入、它的运营、它的数字化的管理、它的科学化的管理、人性化的管理，所有的这些是对中国企业最大的挑战。要真正成为世界级的企业，我们必须面对这些挑战 这是我今天说的点评的10个挑战。我觉得这些挑战对于我们每一个这个企业家，对于每一个从事企业经营的这个学者老师来讲，都是重大的挑战，需要认真的思考，因为它需要一个人的智慧，也需要团队的一种精神。最后呢，我再次感谢I really think I have summarized everything, and eventually you probably will be able to understand every single point is based on what you have said. Okay. In this presentation, and I said in particular these challenges to the Chinese companies in particular. Thank you very, very much, Professor. Thank you, Ms. Lee, for your wonderful translation and cooperation. Thank you, my colleague, Mr. Zhang, and for your cooperation and all the coordinating work. And thank you everyone for tonight's presentation.
Yeah, I'd like to thank all the people. I think we had people from about 15 countries. So I think I'd like to thank everyone who participated in this great event. John, thank you very much. I think we will continue this dialogue. It's a problem is serious, and we have to take it with ultimate seriousness as you have done. And,
Professor, would you please let Ms. Lee to have a very brief translation, since actually you have friends here. Okay, that's very important. Okay.
Go ahead. Yeah, Professor Zhang Yang, I was actually translating in real time while you were speaking to Dr. Ghosh on the chat bar, what you were saying, the 10 summary points that you were doing. But since I have the screen time, can I have 40 seconds to just say thank you to our friends in China, in Europe, in the United States for taking the time out of their day or night to join this discussion. I think, as both of you have said so eloquently, the question about US and China, it's so critical because it's not just about these two countries. It impacts the entire humanity. If China and US can find a way to resolve the issues and work together, the whole world will benefit. Otherwise, we'll head into the Armageddon, as Dr. Ghosh had described. So I think we as global citizens, especially as members of the problem-solving community, we should all work towards the ultimate goal, that desired outcome. And we'll welcome the more questions and comments from the audience if they can send them to either you or to the emails that we have listed. That would be great. We would love to continue the discussions going forward. So thank you again for the opportunity tonight.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I think there are some questions, and some people will be able to send the question to you. But in case actually we have questions, Mr. Zhang, you probably actually summarize the Chinese questions, and we translate, or we don't have to translate. Ms. Lee is there, so we just send the questions back to them. So you definitely will be able to understand the questions, and we can perhaps in the future, in the near future, we'll be able to have some further discussion about some of the in-depth questions left behind. Thanks a lot. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to all. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good night. Good night. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Good night.